Hello and welcome. I'm Catherine Maggs, and this is Continuing the Conversation. It's a conversation series dedicated specifically to the International Women's Day theme. And this series is discussing the 2022 campaign theme of Break the Bias through interviewing amazing humans around the world to better understand what Break the Bias means to them and their individual circumstances. How do they see bias play out in their life? And what are they doing both personally and within their organisations to break the bias? So if you'd like to continue the conversation with me, then please reach out, send a message, email me. I'd love to hear from you. Today, I am chatting with Rudi Landmann. Rudi is many things. They are a long-time people manager in the tech industry, a Pilates, breathing and meditation teacher, a life coach, and a husband and father of two. Rudi identifies as non-binary gender and uses the pronouns they, them. In their life coaching work, Rudi specialises in authenticity coaching, helping women and other femme people get their sparkle back by living closer to their own values and to what brings them joy. I had an absolute ball speaking with Rudi, so please come and join us as we discuss what compassionate curiosity is, the man box, the value our society places on gender, how to reframe the fear of offending, and not to worry, because you know what? None of us have the words. And also how we can measure our own bias using Harvard's Project Implicit test. So let's get chatting. Welcome, Rudi, and thank you so much for taking part of Continue the Conversation. I'm so grateful to have you here today.
Thanks. I'm really excited for the invitation.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. So as you know, we're here to talk about bias. And this has been triggered off the back of International Women's Day's theme, campaign theme, Break the Bias. And obviously bias, although that theme in many ways is specific to gender bias, as we all know, bias plays out in so many different parts of our lives and in so many different ways. How do you feel, or what comes to mind when you hear the word bias?
Well, I think in its strict sense, the idea that we treat people differently based on assumed characteristics of that person, and I say we because it is a product of human cognition. None of us are immune to it, as much as as well-meaning as we might be.
Yeah.
So we do tend to treat people differently based on how we expect or believe them to be, due to factors that have nothing to do with that person whatsoever.
That's right, and that's key, isn't it? And if only we could learn that so much earlier in our lives. It's actually not a reflection of us, that person's views. It's actually a reflection of something that's going on within them.
Absolutely. And we learn these things at a very young age. So I have a special interest in gender and how it is enacted in people's lives. And so, from my reading, my understanding is that, that as humans, we pick up ideas about gender stereotypes whilst we're still toddlers. So kids at kindergarten age can easily distinguish what behaviors, what toys, what clothes, what colors are associated with a particular gender. And then, of course, we make assumptions about how other kids are going to behave or play, or who is appropriate to play with and not appropriate to play with, based on these and other factors.
Yeah, you're right. And the fact that gender is a man-made construct makes that even more fascinating, how we've created these roles and these expectations throughout centuries.
Well, absolutely. It is all culturally, well, or it's the vast bulk of our presumptions about gender are culturally built. If they were not, then we would expect to see the same sorts of assumptions and the same sorts of biases across cultures and across time, and we don't see that. So there's um, a lot of cultural value that is artificially constructed and placed on top of how we interact with other people.
Yeah, that's so true. So true. I have no doubt that you have experienced quite a lot of bias in your time, and we'll get to that. But before we get to that topic, how do you become aware of your own bias? Like, what sort of things do you do to kind of pick up and identify the bias that you carry?
Well, I think listen a lot. And I think by actually engaging with people, either talking to individuals and listening, or through reading and becoming interested in and asking questions about people's experiences and culture. Um, I love I love learning more about how people experience the world, and I mean that is the only way that we can get around the programming that we all carry in our heads, that because we've grown up in a particular cultural environment, we have absorbed beliefs about normality from that culture, and then we encounter something that's different and unexpected, and there are different ways we can respond to that. Like there was a really interesting interaction that I observed on Facebook a while ago, where a particular, and this is a group of this is a group on Facebook which is mostly made up of parents
Okay.
of sort of teenage children. And one parent had just become aware of a subculture. And the details here are not important, other than the fact that this was the first time this parent had heard that such a subculture existed amongst teens.
Okay.
Um, and their reaction was of absolute dread, and this is weird, and this is terrible, and this can't, how could anyone be into this? And it was purely innocuous stuff.
Mm.
and
Instead of
and I
being
thought, well,
curious.
yeah, exactly. So that's interesting, right? It's interesting
Mm.
that, well, and I mean, I also pointed out in that forum that, well, actually the subculture you're describing has been around probably since before you were born. And I can attest to the fact, I'm a little bit of an older parent, but I can attest to the fact that what you're concerned about here as being new and weird and scary,
Mm.
I know that has been in Brisbane since the 1980s. So
Yeah.
um but the point of recounting that is really not about saying that someone's reaction was bad or something, but it's just this question of curiosity. When we encounter something new,
Mm.
something that is different or unexpected to us, we have a choice of how can we react. And I would prefer always to stand in curiosity when something is new or strange or unexpected.
And how can we, because quite often I get a sense that those initial knee-jerk reactions, those biases come up, are quite often the underlying emotion there is fear.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
It's that fear of the unknown. It's the fear of something different. And I wonder how we can flip that, and use that energy to be curious, as you say, because a position of curiosity is most definitely the best position to be in.
As a mindset teacher, I would say that it comes from that the curiosity comes with practice,
Mm.
and that any behavior or any attitude that we want to change in ourselves, it comes from practice. If you want, it's like I say to my kids, how do you get good at anything? You just do it a lot.
Yeah,
um,
that's true.
and so it's about catching that thought. It's about having the willingness to recognize, oh, wow, okay, I am having that fear or concern reaction. And again, thinking about that parents forum, what people were concerned about was the safety of their children. That's a really powerful emotion. That's what we all want, right? We want our children to be safe and happy. So it comes from a good place and an understandable place. But then the question is, okay, well, I've felt that. That's what, to me, that's what fear or that kind of parental protective concern, that's what that feels like. I know that I'm feeling that. Okay, so how do I acknowledge the thought, I acknowledge the feeling, I let it go, and now I can reapproach this new piece of information with, I like to use the word compassionate curiosity.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. I wonder if you mind sharing with us, what is one bias of your own that you have identified through that conscious awareness and gone, wow, I did not know that I had that sitting there?
Well, one thing that I found extremely challenging for myself is that even as I try to function in that space of compassionate curiosity. I like to think that I approach people with kindness and fairness and empathy.
Yeah.
And then as part of my business studies, I actually was introduced to a tool, the Harvard Implicit Bias tool. Do you know this tool?
I actually haven't.
Wow, okay. It can be a bit challenging
Okay.
when you use it. So basically,
I might
it's
put
called,
it on me.
yeah, please do. It's called the Harvard Implicit Bias test, or there's a series of tests. And what it was, as the name implies, it came out of Harvard. And what they do is it's an online test. It's free. You can do it anonymously and freely. And they present a set of word associations for you. And some of them are are ones that are intended to uncover a bias, and some of them are just neutral correlations. So and you have to press different keys on your keyboard to correlate these ideas. And so what they're doing is they're presenting you with words that, for example, might have a gender bias attached to them, because you could do several different versions of the test. So the gender bias one, for example, if they show you the words scientist and woman together, and asking you to pair these words up, are your key presses on the keyboard, are they as fast as when you have neutral terms to correlate? And so they're looking for an unconscious an unconscious hesitancy or discordance in how you're marrying up those terms. And it can be challenging, because these neural pathways in our brains have been established since infancy. We have absorbed every bit of culture, every bit of bias from around us. And so even somebody who is, I would consider myself a champion of women in science and technology.
Yes.
The test still revealed a bias.
So what was it?
Oh, simply that when it was correlating science and technology, I had an implicit bias towards thinking of these as masculine.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? As you say, when that's an area of your expertise, it's an industry that you've been in for a very long time. That's fascinating, isn't it?
I'm horrified to admit what the test result was, but I'm also but it's really important. It's important that we realize that if we are having these biases and that we're carrying them around inside us, that we know that they're there, and we know that even well-meaning and kind people will still carry intrinsic learned biases, as much as we might wish they weren't there.
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, no matter how much you try to remove them, there will be times where they'll still resurface. And I love the fact that you've gone, oh my God, I can't believe I carry that bias after, you know, after all this work I've done. But isn't it also a blessing to have that increased awareness so that next time you're in a position, whether it's hiring, whatever it might be, that is specific to that, you have that opportunity to, because of that awareness, to look at that in a different way and make different choices.
Absolutely. And that's, you know, why I would really encourage our listeners to try it out and just see, what comes up. Well, yeah, and also why I say it's challenging, because it just reveals something that you might not want to see as true about yourself.
And that in itself is another whole aspect of growth and personal growth, isn't it? Is we can go off and we can do these tests and we can increase our self-awareness, but we can also choose not to do anything with the results of that.
Sure.
We can choose to ignore it and make no change in ourselves whatsoever, or we can be confronted. We can do the hard work and become a better version of ourselves.
And I think one of the other things that it shows up is that I think, again, well-meaning and kind people can sometimes think that regardless of what type of bias we're talking about, whether it's gender bias or race or socioeconomic status, there can be a temptation to think, oh, I mean, things are pretty good now. We can that surely these battles are lost. And we often see this, I think, online and in, I guess, online discussions. You know, you'll often see a lot of people, especially around women in the workforce, saying, well, you know, women can have jobs now and they can have careers now, and aren't we done with this? And, you know, ignoring things like the wage gap, or even denying that it exists, which is kind of a weird place to go. But if I don't like the evidence, I'll just say that it doesn't exist. So anyhow, but there can be this temptation to think that the battles are over and done with and won, and then something like getting yourself tested for an implicit bias can reveal to you, actually, you know what? We're not done. As long as these things are still showing up, even in well-meaning people, we are not done. There's still work to do, individually and as a society.
Yes, no, you're right. It is so true. So, how have you seen, you know, through your career, through your own journey, how have you seen bias play out? Whether it's bias that you've experienced personally, or bias that you've seen play out with colleagues?
So I think I've worked in the tech industry for a long time, like in one form or another for about 20 years now, and with the one company for 13 of those years. So in that time, I think, so the tech industry is an interesting one, because at one level it's extremely pragmatic, in the sense that by and large, the tech industry doesn't, at least not at a surface level, doesn't care much about who you are, as long as you can get the job done. Okay. I think that in some ways the tech industry has escaped a lot of the problems of race that I think exist within other industries. I'm not saying it's perfect by any means. I'm just saying that
Oh.
I do think that some of those factors are smaller in the tech industry. What I find interesting, though, particularly in tech, is the involvement of women, and also more than that, the distribution of women. And so, what you do see is a great asymmetry, I think, in the number of women in relatively, entry-level positions versus the number of women in management. And there's a huge drop-off in tech. Also, within the tech industry more broadly, the number of women who you will find in engineering roles versus the number of women you will find in more soft skills roles. So, if you look at a large tech company, are there as many women in engineering? Is there proportionally as many women in engineering as there are in HR, or the facilities team, or in the legal, or the versus the people doing the programming, or the people writing the user manuals, right? And so there is definitely a great disproportion. The team that I currently manage is predominantly female, but it's a technical translation team. Okay. So these are people who are translating software documentation from English into other world languages. So, okay, and so again, it's a predominantly female team, but that distribution is not typical of the company or the industry. So there's still yes, tech has some. I think has escaped some problems, but I think there are still some very uneven distributions that are part and parcel of the industry.
So, from your experience in the industry, what do you think some of the root causes or the challenges are that have resulted in that? That uneven distribution.
Yeah, so it's very difficult to pin down. I do think that there's we know that there is this drop-off effect as careers advance. Part of that is, again, how much of that is the implicit biases that I was referring to earlier. How much of that? So, because that's not only just that, there's an implicit bias not just around women in science and technology, but I think there's also implicit biases around women in leadership. I think that there are, I mean, I'm not talking about the tech industry specifically there, I'm talking about like right across the board. I think there are even hiring practices. We know that hiring practices can definitely make both hiring and career advancement more difficult for women when women have been socialized in particular ways that women have been socialized in particular ways, and traditional hiring practices have evolved along a very different, in fact, opposite route.
Yeah. Okay. So what about at a personal level? Have you experienced bias, or and at the time you may not even have thought it was, but in reflection you've been able to see that actually that probably was a bias that has impacted whether it's your career or
So I would say that I have been extraordinarily privileged for most of my life. And one of the ways that one of the ways I love or hearing about this, one of the best analogies that I think I've heard of this is that thinking about like a computer game where you could have a number of different levels of, you can set the game for a number of different challenge levels. Like, are we going to play this on the easiest level or play it on the hardest level?
Yeah.
And I think there's a great comment that if you're presenting to the world as a straight, white, middle class male, you are playing life on the easiest setting.
Yeah.
Because everything is kind of set up to make that really smooth and easy for you. And certainly that is how I have presented through my entire life. And I mean, more recently, I have experienced a change in my gender presentation and gender identity. I do generally present, in public, I generally present now as more feminine. And I think I've experienced some changes in the way that I relate to the outside world. The one that I always come back to, or the one that's, I think, kind of obvious and easy to grasp, is that, so for somebody who is 6 foot tall and for most of my life has, been somewhere around 80 to 100 kilos, I had never previously had to really think about or worry about, where I was walking at what hour of the day or night. I just had kind of complete confidence of my surroundings. But having experienced harassment from mostly groups of young men at on the streets at night, I no longer feel safe necessarily. So if I'm out at night and I am transgressing gender boundaries because of the way that I dress and because of what I'm wearing and how and where I'm going, I don't feel safe anymore.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that.
But
and I know it's reality.
It's reality, and it's what every. I mean, you've experienced it too, and I mean, every woman has experienced it at some level. So, I mean, and that's kind of an obvious one, right? That one's easy to identify, and it's easy to kind of understand. I guess it's a relatable thing. But in terms of what we were talking about before, in terms of career, again, the pragmatism of the tech industry, I think, has shielded me a lot, and also because I had advanced to a fairly senior part of my career before making that visible transition, which I think if that had happened earlier in my life and earlier in my career, maybe maybe I wouldn't have found myself in a leadership position. We can't know. We can't rewind the clock there. But even as I started presenting differently, like there was such a non-reaction from anybody in the office, and it's simply that I put it down to factors like the tech industry is so stereotypically not caring about like how you're presenting, like it's such a casual workforce anyway. There are no ties. Like even at the director level, people aren't wearing shirts and ties. So it's very much t-shirts and t-shirts and jeans sort of environment anyway. That, and even people turning up to work in onesies, or people turning up to work in with bare feet, and facilities gets upset about that. We do have to do something about it. But
there's a health and safety issue there.
but in general, like the fact that I would now turn up in a skirt, or that I would be turning up in I would be or leggings, like it's just not a thing. So I was, again, very, very lucky because that, and I'm also fully aware that that's a privilege that a lot of people who step outside of society's gender rules don't have that privilege and don't have such a good experience.
No, you're
One
right.
one weird thing that I've noticed is that and I don't know whether this is actually a bias effect or not, but my Uber rider rating is still pretty good. But I did notice that when I started presenting more, as outside of those boundaries, it seemed that there was a correlation in time with me losing a few points off my rider score. And I don't actually know, and it doesn't actually bother me, or it hasn't affected me as far as I know. But I thought it was curious that
Yeah. It is a very curious observation. And, as you say, you're not going to know the real cause behind that, but you can make, based on our own understanding and knowledge of how those implicit bias work, you could make a fairly safe assumption, I think.
I think so. So, but again, if my only experience of that has been that I've lost a few points on my Uber rider score, and that I do have to just be a little bit more fearful at night. That's still a pretty low price to pay compared to the systemic biases that other people experience, and that the privilege that I have experienced on the other hand.
There must have been, so at some point you've made that decision to cross that boundary and express more in a feminine way. You must have felt, especially that first time going to work, I have no doubt you must have felt an extreme amount of fear and God knows what sort of other emotions. What was the tipping point for you, or what was the trigger for you to go, I am going to do this. This is me, and this is how I want to express myself?
So I think for a lot of people, there comes a point where the pain of not expressing yourself, the unhappiness, or the feeling of being unable to be yourself, that becomes greater than the fear of what could happen here.
Yeah.
And so for me, I remember the very first time that I went out of the house in clothing that was not went outside the house in female clothing, was when I was a beautiful pair of Lorna Jane tights that I wore to a running, like to my weekly park run, on one Saturday morning. And I put those tights on and took them off 3 times before I stepped out of the door. Simply because there is and so this is part of the bias around that we have. One of the interesting things here is that particularly for a man to cross that boundary, is seen as shameful in our society. But that itself says something about femininity and about how we value masculine and feminine. And so you, for example, I use this I use this example a lot, but you could go into the menswear section of Maya, and you could literally buy and wear anything from that whole section, and that fitted you, and nobody would bat an eyelid.
No, you're right.
For a man to do that in the ladies' wear section, it's going to be a completely different reaction. Because a woman presenting as masculine is gaining power and status. A man presenting as feminine is losing power and status.
You've just opened up a hole in my brain when you made that comment about it's, you know, the culture sees that, or our society sees a man dressing as a woman as a shameful thing because of, and this is the bit that just light bulb moment, because that actually says something about how society perceives women.
Absolutely.
Wow, that's huge. And it's like, it's so true, but it's not something I had even, you know, in all my femininity and my feminism and my passion around breaking down the patriarchy, so to speak. That's not even something that I had come to me as an idea, that there is that element of shame. Wow, that's a big one.
And because you mentioned patriarchy, I mean, the patriarchy damages and limits men as well.
I know, I do, yes.
So it,
because if you're not the right type of man,
because man is very tightly constrained. There's a QUT academic, Michael Flood, who
okay,
writes a lot about this, and he has a concept he calls the man box, which is a shorthand for how society constructs masculinity and manhood. And it's interesting because he interviews his research has interviewed a lot of young men in particular, asking them about these concepts. And it's interesting because whether or not these young men say that they believe these things or not, there's a very strong consensus about what what is in the man box, what those traits and characteristics and beliefs are, and behaviors are. And so everyone can kind of agree what's there, and then they will disagree about whether or not they themselves believe all of those things.
Yeah.
But the fact that we all know and can agree with what that looks like means that there is a very powerful cultural construction there. Yeah. And that we have all learned it. We've learnt that script. We've learnt that script, as I was saying before, since we were basically since we got here, since we arrived, we've been learning
or
that.
Even beforehand, you know, if you look at some of the studies around epigenetics and that kind of thing. The other thing too, you know, just on that point, and this is conversations I quite often have with the work I do with men in helping them understand their biases and how they can help, you know, lift the people around them that don't look and sound like them, is that you might believe and you might say that you are all for equality and that you know, think women are just as capable, or whatever it might be, or race, they're just as capable as you are. But does that actually show in your life? How does that truly play out? If you are in a relationship and you are a father, then who does most of the housework? I'm not saying you don't do any, but who does most of it? You know, like, and how did you grow up? Did you grow up with a mum and dad that probably were both working, but did mum still do all the housework and dad still did all the yard work? So even though you say these things outwardly, what are your behaviors actually demonstrating? Do they correlate? Do they align?
Yeah, look, and great questions here. So where I came from, I had a dad who worked and a mum who, for most of our childhood, had put her career on hold. She was a social worker, and she had put her career on hold to raise the family. Yeah. She returned to work, you know, later when we were teenagers, I think, or late teens into our early adulthood. She returned to the workforce then. And so, yeah, we grew up in that very traditional household where dad was out working, and mum looked after the home and the kids. My own household right now. I have a wife of I've got a wife of 15 years, and two beautiful sons. And I would say that even now, I would say that our division of work, it still often follows those traditional patterns.
Yeah.
In terms of, I mean, we're both working, but in terms of what we do around the house, it's definitely not an equal split. And it's also complicated because I have my mother-in-law living with us as well, and so I think there's a generational effect there as well, where she also takes on a lot of the house work for both of us. And I'm very conscious.
After your boys too.
She does.
Yeah,
and it is, I am really concerned about how these things perpetuate through generations, and also, whilst there, I am immensely grateful for the help that the boys are having this great experience that they're growing up with their nana, living in a literal granny flat in our home, but they are also growing up having a woman cleaning up after them, and taking care of them, and that's it's problematic, and on a day-to-day basis, it's a constant.
So how do you have those conversations with them? Because no doubt, I mean, yes, when we talk about gender roles, that is alive and well, but at the same time, they've got a dad that's pushing those barriers. So what sort of conversations do you have with them around gender stereotype and gender roles and those?
I think we're just kind of getting into there, because they're now 9 and 10 years old, and so the level of awareness and the level of understanding is, I think, starting to deepen. I mean, part of it. So in practical terms, it is encouraging them, as I think every parent encourages their children to maybe a little bit more considerate and a little bit more self-reliant about maybe we don't need to just leave. We've finished eating that. Maybe we don't just leave the plate sitting there. Maybe we could, I don't know, wash it up or put it away, or
at least I mean, to the sink.
something. So there is that around there's the modeling and being able to show them, actually, no, we all pitch in and do stuff around the house. But I think there's also the I guess the more theoretical, I guess the more the discussion part of it. So I mean, obviously by now they are both old enough to have realized that their dad does not do a lot of stuff that's different from what the dads of their peers do, and that I present differently, and so one thing is, I think, the importance of story. I think we understand the world through stories as human beings, and so encouraging them, again, to, when we were talking before about understanding people's stories. I mean, the elder boy in particular, he's an avid devourer of nonfiction, and there are a couple of great books that have been very valuable to him, and there are a couple of books called Stories of Boys Who Dare to Be Different, and these are stories about men. So, and they're little biographies. Each guy gets a page, but and it's written for kids around his age, where these are men who have become successful or esteemed, or we know about them, but not because not because they were necessarily sporting heroes or particularly, I guess, military figures, but there was always something, whatever it was about them, there was something different. So so these books also, tell the stories of gay men and point out that that is who they were. Tell the stories of trans men, men with different disabilities and different cultural backgrounds. So that's, I think, if we're talking about bias in more general terms, the story is really important. And one beautiful thing that happened just the other week was, are you aware of Taryn Brumfitt and her Embrace project? So has done a lot with women's body positivity. Yeah, and she released a documentary a few years ago about body positivity for women, and she has just released a new documentary called Embrace Kids, and it's about kids. And when I went to see it, when it premiered a little while ago, I expected it to be really just about shape and size, which is the main thing that the first film was about. But in fact, the diversity that she was showcasing in that film is not just kids with different shapes and sizes, but race, with gender, disability.
Beautiful.
And it's a beautiful, beautiful film. And I tell everybody you should see it, even if you don't have kids, because it'll give you hope for the future, because the kids that she showcases are amazing. But what I loved watching with my two boys who came with me that day was that, and I mean, this is very simplistic, and it's just a stepping stone, I guess. But when I was watching them, they were enthralled by these kids on the screen. And in particular, there was one little boy, and I've forgotten the name of his condition, but he is very, very physically different. But it was almost like they didn't see it. They were interested in him because, oh wow, he's got his own YouTube channel, and oh wow, he plays the same, he's into the same games that we're into. And that was what they were interested in. They weren't, I mean, if they'd met him in person, it might have been different, but at least on the screen, they were not, I don't think they were even curious about his physical condition. They just thought he was cool.
They were able to connect, and that, at the end of the day, that connection will override any difference.
We hope so. And this is the thing. This is that whole principle of even in Scandinavian countries, they started that idea of the living library book, where you could go to a library and actually talk to somebody with a different generation or a different culture or a different life experience. And I mean, coming full circle, this is that idea of compassionate curiosity once more, and that one of the biggest tools that each of us has access to contest our own intrinsic biases that each and every one of us have, is just by exposing ourselves to people who are different. And whether it's in person or whether it's reading about or watching documentaries, and trying to imagine, well, what is it, how is this person's life? Why is it different from mine? How is it different from mine? And that gets us a long way.
Yeah. I think the other powerful thing is that there is no right or wrong way to live a life, because we are so very different.
Yeah, broadly speaking, I would say yes. I mean, there is that thing they call the paradox of tolerance, which is that though we shouldn't tolerate intolerance. So
of course, there's always a line.
But yeah, so that's that exposure and that willingness to engage with, and willingness to, as I keep saying, be curious about, rather than judgmental about. And part of, and part of that, and something that I really wish that I try to encourage people towards, is that the idea that there's a lot of people who, when confronted by difference, sometimes we don't know what to ask, or we can be curious about something, but we also don't want to give offense, or we don't want, and that's a beautiful instinct, right? Most people generally don't go through life trying to be offensive or hurtful towards other people. So sometimes if we're unsure, we can shy away from questioning. And I would encourage people to think about two things. Number one, I would love people to not think about offense so much, because people can be offended by anything, right? So little things, big things, things that are rational, things that are completely okay. That's maybe not so proportionate, but what would happen if, instead of thinking about who am I going to offend, we started thinking in terms of who am I going to welcome, or how am I going to make this space or this community or this event or whatever it is, how can I be as welcoming to as many people as possible and help people understand you belong here, you're fine here, we want to have you here. How do we do that rather than focus on offense? And that would be, I think that's transformative. If we stop worrying about offense and start thinking about, I mean, we could call it inclusion, but I think that now sounds a bit clinical, or a bit it's become corporate. So let's talk about welcoming. Let's talk about
like
welcoming.
Anything that we pick up and flog, it just becomes, a connotation becomes attached to those words, because we've been talking about inclusion for so long now, but yet we're still not including people. So, we talk and we tick boxes, but behaviorally those things don't actually flourish or eventuate. But I love the concept you've just been talking about, because I've found myself in that position where I've wanted to engage, but then thought, how do I do that without offending? And when you're talking about what you were talking about there, about making people feel welcome, don't focus on the offense, but it comes down to just making someone feel like they belong, that they're just as human as you are, that we're no different. And I think too, it comes from the intent that you have behind that wanting to engage. I think that's the key. If your intent is pure love and care and compassion, then I don't think we should be worried about offending.
99 times out of 100, human beings can tell the difference in intention. We're hardwired for this. We are social animals. We have a large part of our brain that is devoted to processing those cues. We can tell the difference between, if somebody asks us a question, we can tell the difference whether that's being motivated by judgment or gatekeeping, or whether it's being motivated by compassionate curiosity. Now, again, some people might have had experiences that have damaged them, or that can create a hypersensitivity around certain topics, and that's okay. So if you approach situations and ask questions in compassionate curiosity, it's almost certain that sometime, you're going to upset somebody.
Guaranteed.
It's guaranteed. But then you can also upset somebody for all kinds of other reasons, right? So I think if the intention is good and the intention is clear, and you can even preface it by saying, look, I don't even quite know how to ask this, but I would really love to know whatever it is that is curious. And again, and if I think with the right, if the intention is clear, even by the approach or even by the context, then even the words don't have to be perfect. I've had people ask me all kinds of very direct, very blunt questions. I'm lucky, and again, it's part of the privilege that I've enjoyed up to this point that puts me in a good place where I'm not particularly sensitive about the way what people ask me or how they ask me. Because I've sat down at events and I've had people who I've literally just met say things to me like, "How long have you wanted to be a woman?" Well, that's we could start like, "Oh wow, this is an interesting lecture first," but we'll go straight there. Okay. So,
yeah. Forget the pleasantries.
So, and it doesn't bother me. I'm happy to talk about that, and I'm happy to, but again, the presumptions around that. But again, it's easy to have conversations if they're approached where you can just tell the person asking that question, it's extraordinarily awkwardly worded, but it was genuine. It was curiosity. There was no curiosity. It wasn't about judgment or about exclusion or about, it was just about, oh well, this is an interesting, I want to know more. And so it was clear that this is not somebody who was having a go at me or anything. It was somebody who was just curious, if awkward. And so I would encourage people to think firstly in terms of that welcome rather than in terms of who am I going to offend, but also to ask the question. And I mean, hopefully you'll do better than that person did, but even if you don't, like, and even if you do want to preface it with, I don't know quite what I'm asking, or I don't know what the words quite are, because honestly, none of us know what the words are.
No.
Our language is not set up for this. So even our notion of binary gender that we have in Western culture, that is a cultural construction.
Yep.
And we're only now inventing vocabulary around, like, I mean, I identify as non-binary, that I have a gender outside of masculine or feminine. I identify, but that's a relatively new word in the English.
That's right.
And then we have people who identify as gender fluid, whose sense of masculinity or femininity changes regularly over time, whether from day to day or morning to afternoon. Again, these are new words. As I was starting my own self-discovery, I didn't have the words. So I don't expect anyone else to have the words either. Even I, experiencing it, didn't have words.
And that must have been challenging, right? When you're
it was because it came out of the blue.
And you're experiencing these emotions and these feelings, and you don't have anything to describe it with. You don't have tools to be able to communicate that to yourself, let alone anybody else. That must be extremely challenging.
It was extremely challenging, yeah. And I guess it's why I'm so passionate now about being open myself, so that if people can ask questions, if people have questions or they want to know more, then I'm very happy to talk and to share my work in progress. This is what I've come to understand about myself in the last few years. And these are the words that I use now. But I had this beautiful experience because, not all cultures have just two binary genders in the way that they understand how people fit into society. And in particular, some Polynesian cultures have 3 genders.
Okay.
And I was having a conversation with and I'd read about this, and so I had a theoretical understanding of how those cultures function. But again, I wanted to understand it. I wanted it from somebody who lived within that culture, and I had a beautiful opportunity to talk to a Tongan woman about how that third gender, from our perspective, kind of an in-between gender,
Okay.
how that functions in their society. And so I asked her about, I'm not going to embarrass myself
No,
and
that's okay.
pronounce the term today, but anyone can look this up. And I asked her about that, and she was clearly struggling to put it into English because this is another example. It doesn't translate well. And then she started defining it a couple of words, and then she just looked at me and said, "People like you."
Oh, bless.
But people like you. Wow. And I don't even have a word in my own language for people like me.
No.
But she did. And so again, because I work professionally in the translation part of the tech industry, I'm fascinated by how language and culture interact and how these things are entwined with each other in a very fundamental kind of way. But that was a really moving experience for me. But again, because I had not grown up with that word. I had not even encountered that word as I was starting to experience, these thoughts and feelings that were new to me and completely unexpected. This is something, this change in the way that I understood my gender identity and gender expression is something that hit me in my mid-40s. So, and completely out of the blue. This was not a journey I was expecting to take. And not having the words for any of it. And so it's been a journey of exploration for me too. And some of that compassionate curiosity I keep talking about was I had to express that towards myself first and foremost.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was a very long way around of saying that, don't get hung up on the words. The person you're talking to might not have the words either. And even if they do, they themselves almost certainly had the same experience of not even having the words for their own experience to begin with. So
beautiful.
We get it, right? we totally get that you don't have the words because sometimes we don't either. And
that's
so ask
a key
questions.
message, I think that's a very key and important message, is that your ability to offend is going to be so much reduced and limited because the people you're engaging with didn't have, and maybe still don't have the words. So therefore don't feel ashamed yourself or worried yourself that you don't have the words. That I think is a very important message. Oh, Rudi, I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking I just want to keep talking to you and talking to you. It's just been amazing this morning. I'd like to just finish with one more question.
Sure.
If we can. Why do you feel breaking the bias is so important? What is it about that drives you?
Common human decency. The idea that I strongly believe that as human beings, we all have the same intrinsic value. There's nothing about anybody as we all arrive on this planet in more or less the same way. And there is absolutely nothing about that individual human that makes them worth more or worth less than anybody else at that intrinsic level.
Yeah.
So to basically to harbor some kind of bias or prejudice towards any group of people because of any characteristic that they have is, intrinsically unfair and intrinsically unjust. And I have a very strong value around justice.
Amen. Well, thank you for today, for your time, for being part of continuing the conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've loved every minute of speaking with you today.
Thank you so much.